Oh, ladies and gentlemen, I guess we can start now as everybody has found a place to sit. I would like to welcome all of you in the German Bundestag, and I hope also the visitors on the screen and in the offices. We have, I think, a very interesting discussion ahead of us, and I'd like also to welcome everybody from the German Bundestag, but especially our former minister, Dirk Niebel. Nice to have you with us today. And I hope you'll find the discussion interesting as well. We're talking today about Zeitenwende, which is the turn of eras in Germany, in English. And so German defense policy in an area of great power conflicts. And I think this is something quite unusual for Germany, because Germany, I think, has been daydreaming for a long, long time. And now, also from the perspective of our allies, woken up of some kind, at least a lot of people hope so, and this will be our discussion today. So we are at a turning point in Europe, but not just in Europe. I think we have seen the comeback of great power politics. We have a war in Europe and the threat of war on other points in the world. The question is, will Germany properly be positioned in this era? So the idea of this event came up to me when we actually, Elbridge and me, we talked about it in November in Washington. I was there as a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, and we had an interesting talk about your book, which I guess your keynote will be based on it. And this was a very common perspective for me, but it's not very common to Germany. So I think it would be very helpful if you can explain it as to many Germans as possible. So good to have you with us today. You served as an assistant secretary of the Defense of the Ministry of Defense and for Strategy and Force Development, and are now the co-founder of the Marathon Initiative. So I'm very looking forward for your keynote. And we will have a panel discussion, which will be, you will be our moderator from the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, Theresa Winter, and I guess you will introduce everybody else. So I'm very happy to have all of you here. And I think, let's go forward.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Faber. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak here in front of this audience and to all of you watching online. It's really a privilege to be able to speak, as you said, with this platform, so I'm grateful for the invitation. My remarks this evening will address the fundamentally changed geopolitical environment in which we are all now living, what it means for the United States and Europe, and how together we can most productively address these more severe challenges that this new environment presents us with. Let me say at the beginning, though, that I think that the Zeitenwende announced by Germany a few months ago offers a very commendable and solid basis for going forward. Now we need to act and build on it together. I will try to sketch out the broad outlines of how. From the collapse of the Soviet Union until a few years ago, we lived in what some called the unipolar era. The United States was far stronger than any other state, and meanwhile, the other more significant states in the international system were largely U.S. allies. The international security situation reflected those facts. With a weak post-Soviet Russia and a still developing China, the U.S. military could essentially, on its own, handle any plausible threat to Washington's far-flung alliance network. The biggest threats to it were relatively weak rogue states, as we used to call them. Indeed, Washington was so powerful that it could aspire to simultaneously defeat adversaries in multiple theaters and conduct regime change onto them, which is to say forcibly change the government in those states. This was the vaunted two-war standard of U.S. defense planning. This was an exceptionally secure and comfortable situation for most U.S. allies. It was therefore hardly surprising that many of them effectively demilitarized in these years. This was especially the case in Germany, which embraced a peaceful European continent amidst notions of an end of history. Germany's demilitarization after the Cold War was in many respects then a rational decision. Cold War West Germany faced an immediate and dire security threat, and a robust Bundeswehr was the result. Post-Cold War Germany, on the other hand, faced no such threat, and to boot, it could prove it no longer had any aggressive ambitions by disarming. Thus, a demilitarized Germany fit its post-Cold War world quite nicely. That world is now gone, however, and it requires us all to change our thinking and actions accordingly. This is for one reason more than any. China. China has now definitively risen, and it looks set to continue rising. China is already an enormous economy, either the largest or the second largest in the world, depending on the metric that you use. And with the largest peacetime military buildup in generations, China's armed forces are now by far the most powerful conventional military in the world, save those of the United States itself. Nor does China appear likely to just sit back and admire this military that it has built. Rather, Beijing seems focused on establishing first regional hegemony over Asia, which is the world's largest market area and is growing in share, and from that position establish global preeminence. Its first target, it is now commonly agreed, is likely to be Taiwan. But an increasing weight of evidence indicates that Taiwan would not be the end of China's ambitions. With a widening network of bases and a military clearly suited for distant power projection, Beijing's ambitions are clearly global. Yet China is not the only threat that the United States and its allies and partners now face. As we, of course, plainly see in Ukraine, there is also Russia, and there are also Iran, North Korea, and jihadi terrorism, and maybe more, depending on your perspective. Together, these factors mean that the United States must consider the potential for getting into several conflicts in widely separated theaters of the world, and doing so on roughly concurrent timelines. Moreover, such conflicts might well involve powerful adversaries, not just the rogue state threats of years past. Now, such simultaneous conflicts might happen because of chance, but they also might happen deliberately. Russia might stoke conflict in Europe precisely to help its now closer ally, China. Iran might see advantage while America is focused on Asia, and so forth. This is critical to reckon with because the American military is sized and shaped based on its preparedness to deal with certain kinds of conflicts, certain scenarios in the military vernacular. And the fact is that the United States cannot handle all of these potential conflicts essentially on its own, most certainly not simultaneously. Rather, the United States has to focus, picking where to concentrate its efforts. We cannot be everywhere at once with dominant force. We can think of this as a military scarcity, to use an economics term. This scarcity is most acute in the decisive elements of modern warfare: long-range attack aircraft, submarines, munitions, logistics, and the productivity of the defense industrial base. We do not have enough of these things to fight multiple conflicts on even roughly concurrent timelines, especially against major powers like China and Russia. Even things seemingly as prosaic as artillery shells can quickly become scarce, as we now see in the case of Ukraine. Indeed, it's not even clear that we have enough of these key things or in the right place to win in some of the toughest scenarios we have to contemplate, especially against China. Now, this scarcity is ultimately more a product of structural reality than choice. It's a reflection of fundamental shifts in the global distribution of power, above all the rise of China, a true peer superpower of the United States. It's thus not something that can be solved simply by mustering more resolve or spending more money or by developing a more clever strategy. We can ameliorate these dilemmas by spending more and spending smarter, but we are not going to simply eliminate them. Now, in actuality, the need to adjust to the structural imbalance has already been recognized in the U.S. defense establishment. We did so in the United States with the 2018 National Defense Strategy, when the Pentagon shifted focus from fighting and winning 2 wars at once to focusing on winning a single great power war, above all against China, precisely in order to deter that war from happening. Most significantly, the Biden administration's 2022 National Defense Strategy has carried this policy forward, maintaining this one-war force planning construct and the focus on China and Asia, naming Taiwan as the Pentagon's pacing scenario. This all has profound implications for European security. The simple fact is that the United States does not have the power to handle China in Asia while also maintaining such a dominant military position in other theaters, particularly Europe and the Middle East. This means there is and will be a deficit of American military power somewhere, and this will leave vulnerabilities which the countries I listed previously might well seek to exploit. So how should the United States and its allies handle this divergence between America's military capacity on the one hand and the challenges to this alliance network on the other? One option is to try to pretend that America can still be militarily dominant in multiple theaters. Frankly, this is more or less what seems to be happening now on both sides of the Atlantic, I should say. But this is not grappling with the facts, and doing so will only delay the reckoning and may make it much more severe if and when it does come. If the United States does not allocate sufficient forces and attention and resources to China and Asia, Beijing will have a greater incentive to attack Taiwan and possibly beyond. If this happens, the United States will have to shift its attention, likely radically and disruptively. If Europeans are not prepared for this scenario, they could be left very vulnerable. A second option is for Europe and Germany to do little, hoping that America will pick up the slack as we have done in the past. But things are genuinely different now. If Europeans do little, the ultimate result is more likely to be a security vacuum in Germany's immediate environment, rather than America continuing to shoulder the burden of filling it. If Europe elects not to assume such a role, in practice it will force a choice upon the United States. Try to maintain deterrence and defense in Europe against Russia at the expense of our ability to do so in Asia against China, or continue increasing the focus on Asia at greater risk of Russian aggression in Europe. We cannot know how China will choose to navigate this choice, but I think I can say what the right choice for Americans would be, and thus what is likely to win out. Prioritize Asia, the world's largest market area, and thus decisive theater, and accept risk in Europe. Of course, the United States would strongly prefer to avoid this outcome. I certainly would, but a laggardly European response would take that option off the table. A better alternative for both America and Europe is if we can adapt to this new reality in concert. The model that would work best is for the United States to focus on China and Asia while remaining committed to NATO, but alongside greater efforts by Europe in its own self-defense. In this model, Europe would take the primary responsibility for its own conventional defense, something which is well within its economic capacity, while the United States would take a more focused role within NATO. I'll get back to what this would entail shortly. This prioritization by Washington on Asia makes sense actually both for America and Europe for several reasons. First, the Chinese military threat is by far the most acute. Bear in mind that China is 10 times the GDP of Russia. The United States is the only state with any possibility of leading a coalition to stand up to China directly, simply because of our scale. If the United States does not laser focus on Asia, the region will likely fall under Beijing's hegemony. Second, Asia is the primary theater of international politics because of the scale of its economy, which dwarfs that of either the United States or Europe and is likely to outsize both combined over time. This means that if Asia falls under Chinese dominance, it's a grave concern not only for Asians and Americans, but also for Europeans. A Beijing predominant over the world's largest market area would be in a position to exercise dominant sway over the economies and ultimately the politics of both a fractious Europe and even the United States. I think it's worth thinking about if we are so worried about such a dominant China and we are a united 330 million people, what does that mean for Europe? Thus, Europe itself benefits indirectly but very concretely from America's focus on Asia. At the same time, though, the rise of China has, of course, not removed the threat Russia poses to European NATO, as has been made very clear by Russia's abominable invasion of Ukraine in the recent months. And while Russia has faced difficulties in its assault on Ukraine, I think it's imprudent to count Moscow out. Russia appears to have the will to sustain its military assault on Ukraine for some time and seems likely to have the resolve to regenerate much of its military power to threaten NATO. So how do we deal with this persisting Russian threat? The most pressing military scenario for NATO is a Russian fait accompli incursion against an ally in northeastern Europe, such as the Baltics, Poland, or if it comes into NATO, potentially Finland. If Russia were to succeed in breaking off significant territory from an ally, the consequences for the alliance would be significant and could even be grave, including possibly the dissolution of the alliance. It seems likely that, at a minimum, such an eventuality would result in much greater instability in Europe, or worse, major portions of Eastern Europe falling under Russian control, whether direct or indirect. Few countries, I imagine, would suffer more from this outcome than Germany. Given America's need to focus on Asia, the natural way to fill this gap would be for NATO's European members to assume the bulk of the conventional military role in this scenario. In this model, European allies would quickly develop, ready, and posture the forces needed to blunt and ideally defeat any Russian invasion of a NATO ally, of course, alongside American contributions that would be more limited compared to those expected today. At the same time, the United States would remain committed to NATO, but concentrate its contributions largely on forces that it could provide without undermining its specific posture, such as our nuclear arsenal and more focused contributions from our conventional forces. In this context, a cohesive and effective defense of NATO would benefit enormously from a single actor taking a leading role in this effort. It seems to me the only plausible candidate in Europe for this role is Germany. Germany alone has the population, the economic scale and sophistication, the political relationships, and the geographic position at the center of Europe to play this leading role. In this context, Berlin could tightly focus on rapidly fielding these capable ground, tactical air, and logistics forces sized and shaped for a defense of Eastern NATO and potentially Scandinavia, using the defense of the Baltics and Poland and possibly Finland as planning scenarios, to get back to the core of defense planning. This core German force would enable other states such as Britain, France, Poland, Benelux, and the Scandinavian countries to complement or even integrate their forces into an effective whole under the rubric of NATO collective defense. Such a conventional military would be well within Germany's economic capacity to build, given the country's economic strength, and also, I believe, its proud post-war traditions as part of an integrated NATO collective defense. Of course, the Cold War Bundeswehr was the second most powerful force within NATO. I believe it had 12 active divisions in 1988 along the inter-German border. Fortunately, Berlin seems to have already taken a major step in this direction with its Zeitenwende commitments, which should enable Germany to begin pursuing this course. The Zeitenwende is thus an historic and enormously commendable step by Germany, as it points in the direction of a truly collaborative solution to this global set of problems that we as allies now face. Russia's Ukraine invasion has shown us that the only sure security is an effective defense. I think it's clear from what's happening in Ukraine that it's not the sanctions or political criticism of Moscow, but the fighting prowess of the Ukrainians with our transatlantic support that is stopping the Russian invasion, or at least hampering it. And the Zeitenwende promises to begin realizing Germany's vital contribution to the noble goal of collective defense. Now, the critical thing now is for Germany to implement those spending commitments, but with a focus on speedily developing real and combat-credible or combat-ready military forces that can work with other allied armed forces to be able to defeat, and thus, we all hope, deter Russian aggression against NATO. In closing, the basic logic here is to avoid war, but I believe the only prudent way to achieve that goal is to be prepared for it, and prepared for it in a very specific and credible way. And the fact is that we will be vulnerable if we ignore the realities of a much-changed global power structure. By grappling with reality, though, we can see things plainly and prepare accordingly. I believe this will be the surest guarantee of peace in a time when I don't think we can take it at all for granted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kolbe. That was a great introduction to our panel discussion on Zeitenwende, German defense policy in an era of great power conflict. There were some particular interesting facts that I quickly noted down that I'm very happy to pass on to the panelists here to discuss in a second, especially on China and the Indo-Pacific theater, and the role of various actors, also including Germany maybe or not. And the other one is the idea of a core German force, where Britain and France and others might or might not integrate their forces. I'm very curious to see the panelists' reaction to that. So before I start, ladies and gentlemen from near and far, welcome from my side as well. My name is Teresa Winter. I work for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, and I manage all security and defense policy related aspects for the foundation. So let's get right into it. I will allow each panelist a few minutes of an own input statement, and I will lead it by a quick question, and then I'll open up the panel for discussion internally, and then I will ask you to provide questions if you have any. I received some via email as well. So let's start. Mr. Lechte, I'll start with you. You are foreign policy spokesperson for the Free Democratic Party in the Bundestag. You are also deputy chair of the FDP in Bavaria. I know a lot has changed since February. You've also been appointed foreign policy spokesperson in February. So I'm very curious to see how you react to Mr. Kolbe, especially on, I think previously you've been focusing a lot on multilateralism as well, with a strong lead nation in Europe. What's your view on that? And then, of course, how has your field of work, your position changed or not changed in the past 4 months? Thank you.
Well, you all know the the saying in Germany, ins kalte Wasser geworfen. In my part, it was not cold water, it was hot water, because just after my appointment, it started. And so at first I would like to give you all a warm welcome tonight here, especially our former Minister Dirk Niebel. I'm happy to have you with us today. Also, dear Mr. General, that you are here on our panel tonight is wonderful as well. And ladies and gentlemen, I have a speech as well, like you, and I'll make it, and later on we are able to discuss on a bunch of stuff, but I can tell you I can put my signature under your sharings and your thoughts, because I stated such things before the 24th of February already on my meetings and party meetings, and when we made campaign, when I was talking about China and the effects, and that's going to be the capital conflict of the 21st century, what's going on in the Pacific. So that was one point of good stuff that Donald Trump did when he started his approach on China, and stated about his backing of Taiwan and all the 16, for example, the F-16, the 66 he sold to Taiwan. But actually stating now would be, dear ladies and gentlemen, that the February 24th of this year marked a rupture in Europe, and I call it personally Europe's 9/11. So that Americans do understand what the 24th means for us. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which violates international law, has brought suffering, death, and destruction to our immediate European neighborhood. But it's also a direct attack on our liberal world order and on our multilateral system. For 118 days right now, Ukraine has been defending heroically and sacrificially not only its own territory, but also our European freedom and our common values. For me, it is clear that this war may not pay off for the Kremlin under any circumstances, because otherwise this war will not stop in Ukraine, but will possibly set a precedent. Therefore, Russia must lose this war, and Ukraine must win this war. But for that, Ukraine also needs our support, not only in financial terms, normal German policy, but above all in military terms. Here we have already made major changes in our German foreign policy. The supply of heavy weapons, today just 7 of this wonderful Panzerhaubitze 2000 were delivered. Exports licensing after end-use control and their facilitation via the so-called wing exchange. These are changes that would certainly not have been possible without the involvement of the Liberal Party, the FDP, in the government. Even the motion of the SPD, CDU, CSU, Green and FDP parliamentary groups in the Bundestag to supply heavy weapons to Ukraine was drafted almost verbatim in this way at the Federal Party Conference of the Free Democrats, and was ultimately the basis for the Bundestag's decision. We know, of course, that motions and declarations of intent alone are not enough. Nevertheless, we want to live up to our role, a role that many partners have been expecting of us for years, and which is now slowly and surely shifting into gear. Everybody knows after the Second World War it was a goal of the whole world to pacify Germany and Japan, and today the US has to rely on these partners who learned pacifism and have now to learn how war is going on in the world and what our part will be. We want to be a reliable partner in a transatlantic alliance with approved 100 billion in special funds and the achievement of NATO's 2% target. We will make our armed forces fit again and bring them up to date so that we, as the Federal Republic of Germany, can once again become more capable in defense and more effective. The money will primarily be used to implement major projects that the armed forces have been putting off for years because financing for them has not yet been secured. The largest volume of the planned procurements will be the procurement of aircraft. Around 40.9 billion euros have been earmarked for this, including new F-35 fighter jets nuclear stuff, we all know for what they are. However, it is not only money that is needed for a serious turnaround. We need a change in our self-image in Europe. The United States of America has always played a central role in NATO, for sure. For that, I'm really very grateful. But we Europeans need to make more responsibility. The United States of America will be even more tied up in the Pacific in the future, and we need to be prepared for that. As European democracies, we have a responsibility to each other to defend our free democratic order. We must increase our collective defense efforts and take a clear stance. We cannot afford further hesitation and German restraint, even in the face of Russia's war aggression. We have the potential and the competence to move forward together with our partners. A close foreign and security policy partnership within the EU is essential. The EU would have to expand its instruments, such as the European Peace Facility, in order to provide partner countries with decisive assistance in the procurement of weapons. Today, this applies primarily to Ukraine, but could also be necessary in other cases. This, too, is part of the new reality that we must acknowledge. And German foreign policy is currently undergoing a historic change. That is right. That is what our allies expect of us, the citizens of our country and of the Ukraine. We must and will maintain this course. And I can put one in addition. I met a French senator in Vilnius just short after the war began. And he said he is really, really happy after the speech of the Chancellor that the giant has awakened. And he was talking about Germany, and a French senator of En Marche it was. And also Polish guys said in the same week that they are happy that Germany is starting to buy weapons and collecting its army, and that's something. If Polish people and a French senator are talking like that about Germany, that seems that after 75 years after the end of the Second World War, or 77 right now, it's a new time, it's a Zeitenwende.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lechte. Actually, you've been mentioning already a few facts that I wanted to put to you, Mr. Faber. I will change my question for you then a little bit, because you spoke already a little bit about the 100 billion euro for defense. So I find it interesting that in foreign policy, no, and I think there's going to be much more to be said on that, but it's interesting that when we talk about foreign policy, of course, then defense topics come up quite a lot. So thank you for that. I'll turn to my next panelists. Before I do, you notice probably that there's one missing up front here. What you've seen on the invite, I forgot to mention that in the beginning, very sorry for that. Ambassador Boris Ruge unfortunately couldn't make it because of the world we're living in. That includes a pandemic, but he sends his regrets, of course, and would have liked to be here. With that being said, I'd like to turn to my next panelist, Lieutenant General Wiermann. Thank you so much for being here. You just came today from Brussels, I believe, and we'll go back tomorrow, so thank you for making all the way down here. You're Director General for the International Military Staff of NATO. You have a very impressive career at the German Bundeswehr throughout your 46 I believe years. You've held several positions in command, positions at the MOD, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course at NATO. So I'd be very curious, and thank you very much for sharing your also military assessment of the Zeitenwende. And with regard to the German security policy development, maybe you could give also a little bit of a overview of how that developed over the past 30 years. And how within the NATO headquarters that's been discussed maybe among partners and allies. Thank you.
Well, thank you much for your kind words of introduction. And NATO is, of course, looking to a very historic summit, which will come up by the end of next week. It will be the summit in Madrid. We are right now preparing a strategic concept, and the strategic concept clearly will reflect what has been said here around the table, because that's the background against NATO as the transatlantic and Atlantic European organization needs to put its strategy. Talking about Zeitenwende, and you talked about 30 years, I would say simply the mission for NATO was very clear when it was founded. It was collective defense, it was one-dimensional, it was dangerous, but it was a clear black and white military mission. That changed actually in 1989 with the demise of the Warsaw Pact and the drawdown of the Russian Soviet forces here in Germany, and we experienced a peaceful reunification. Without knowing and recognizing, we entered the era of crisis management, because in the middle of the 90s it became clear that violence had not disappeared, not even from the European country on the Western Balkans. So we started the era of crisis management. Again, a one-dimensional NATO, because we didn't have to care very much about Article 5 and collective defense for the reasons that have been alluded to by Elbridge. I think you mentioned that as well. And honestly, the Zeitenwende, to use this term, which seems to become a kind of realpolitik mirror, I'll see, started already in 2014, because in 2014, one nation in Europe decided to change borders by using military means. And we entered, again, without necessarily recognizing the full dimension, an era where we are now facing a two-dimensional NATO. We are on the one hand still engaged in crisis management in Kosovo, on Kosovo. We are still engaged in Iraq, and we don't know where crisis management will take us in the future. At the same time, we have to redust some of the skills we had in the era of the Cold War. Not moving back, we are far away from that, but we have to redust some of the skills. And the challenges are that we have to place ourselves in this two-dimensional NATO, which is a mindset issue, it's an equipment issue, it's a way of how do we fight. So it's a big, big challenge. And some nations may take different decisions. Some may place themselves more on the axis of crisis management, while others may place themselves more on the axis of collective defense. Having said that, we have started in the military side of NATO to think about a military strategy already in 2019. Because we had the feeling that we had to develop a strategy to think about SACEUR's whole area of responsibility, that's the military term, or about the whole transatlantic European area. And we started that, we finished that in 1990, and we wrote the first military strategy for 50 years, because there was no need. First, the latter one was very good, so it helped us to win the Cold War. At the same time, there was no need to write a new one, because we were in the era of crisis management. So for 50 years, there was actually no need to write something new. We did it in 2019, and we continued with developing concepts to defend and deter in the first place, but if deterrence fails, you have to be able to defend. And we were reasonably prepared for the situation that now unfolded in Ukraine. Everybody was surprised about the decision of Putin to go to war and the violence and the crimes he committed. But militarily, we were in our mindset pretty much prepared. Now you read in newspapers that 40,000 soldiers are under the command of the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. That was only possible because we started in 2019 to think about this kind of Zeitenwende. Coming to the Zeitenwende and now to the German contribution. I think right now Germany has a pretty good standing in NATO. I'm not talking about discussions on is it enough, is it too late, is it too early, is it too much, what we do for Ukraine. Because NATO deliberately took a decision not to be involved as an organization in this support to Ukraine for a number of reasons, not the place to allude to it here right now at this time. Allies do, not NATO as an organization. Allies do it, but NATO not as an organization. So, therefore, we are happy that Germany announced to spend 100 billion on defense investment. To put it in a positive frame, this is a great incentive to the stragglers that lag behind in moving towards spending 2% on defense as agreed in the Defense Investment Pledge in Wales by 2014. And you will see that a number of nations are now coming forward, spending more of defense, and you can imagine that the Secretary General is pretty happy about this development. Then I would like to raise the issue of the decision to buy F-35, which first and foremost enhances the military capabilities of the Bundeswehr. But at the same time, it's a very strong signal that Germany will continue to participate in the nuclear mission of NATO. Dual-capable aircraft, that's the key word that's connected with F-35. That's a very, very strong signal. And when we talk about conventional forces in the Baltic countries, that's very, very important. But the option for the Baltic countries is not to have a small war. The option for the Baltic countries is to have no war. And that works if deterrence works. And deterrence is more than just conventional forces. And it's also more than the nuclear dimension, because nowadays we have new domains like space and cyber and other effects like SWIFT and other instruments of power that can achieve strategic effects. And it's worthwhile to focus sometimes the debate also on these issues. And finally, the German decision to increase the forward presence of conventional forces of the Federal Armed Forces in Lithuania was very well received in NATO. We have a bit of a discussion. Of course, if you were a citizen in the Baltic countries, you would like to have as many soldiers as possible because you feel the breath of the brown bear. On the other hand, the sending nations, and you have heard one line of argument, why it's difficult to provide more forces. And of course, Germany has a central role to play. Its size, its economic power, its geographic location. France, Italy, and others are looking to the south, no secret. Britain is looking global. And so what is left to reinforce our East European partners? Nothing more and nothing less than Germany. And with this decision, I think we have been doing a very good initiative. And we will see whether other nations will follow. But this clearly then would be a great contribution to achieve a consensus, which makes, and here I close the circle, the summit by the end of next week a successful summit, an historic summit that will really change NATO and will ensure that Europeans are taking over more responsibility than in the past. And finally, we have no indications that the Americans will reduce their engagement right now in Europe. We are looking forward to a very moderate increase of engagement. However, the background alluded to by Elbridge needs to be considered at all times because we never know what will happen in East Asia. With that, back to you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, General. Dr. Faber, I would like to give you the word before I open for reactions. You're the host of this event, so most people know you already. Anyways, I will say a few words. So you represent Saxony-Anhalt in the Bundestag, and you're leading the working group on defense policy for the Free Democratic Party, and are a member of the Federal Executive Board of the FDP. So I wanted to ask you a little bit on priorities in defense spending as well, because of course that's part of the Zeitenwende. But in general, maybe you could also dive into a little bit more. You can probably, of course, react to what's been said before, but also dive more into what is it that the Parliament can do more or does already in supporting the Zeitenwende. And when we go into defense spending and the 100 billion, and we know already there's a list out there, you can see where it will be spent on. But where do you see the pitfalls, or where do you see that there needs to be follow-up? Thank you.
Yes, I think I'd like to start with challenging my discussion partners over here. The foreign minister of Germany said there are two kinds of countries in Europe: small countries and countries that don't know yet that they are small. And I think he's right, and that's true even for Germany. We like to compare ourselves to China, but we have less citizens than Vietnam. So that's the continent we are living on. So if we want to make a difference, we have to do together in Europe. But of course, we are the first among equals. We have the biggest society, we have the biggest GDP, and others are looking on us. So we have to go ahead, and hopefully others will follow. That's the world we're living in, and obviously it's an unstable world, as we have just seen in the last months. So this Zeitenwende should have happened earlier. It should have happened 2014, 2015, after the invasion of Crimea. It didn't. So there were some steps taken. Yes, the budget was raised, but the approach was not strong enough. So it has to be strong enough now. Zeitenwende has two elements, basically. We will help Ukraine on humanitarian issues, military issues. We have done some small steps, but it will be a long marathon in the Marathon Initiative. So this is the first element of the Zeitenwende. And the second one, obviously, is arming ourselves to defend our continent and ourselves. So the Parliament has done something. Yes, there is this Sondervermögen, special budget for the Bundeswehr, and we will arm ourselves as fast as possible. So we will buy stuff that is already on the market. The Sondervermögen is not about a development project. We will buy tanks, we will buy fighter planes, we will buy helicopters, we will buy a lot of ammunition, in the morning, my first meeting today was with the inspector of the Luftwaffe. And he says, okay, yes, we have 140 Eurofighters, and we have 80 AMRAAMs, 80 air-to-air missiles, 80. They wouldn't last a day. So that's the situation we are at, and we have to change this. So this is a long way to go. Weapon systems, ammunition. But then we also have to change our mindset, and maybe that's the hardest thing to do. Because even now, not everybody, I guess, is really convinced that defense and security is not a foregone conclusion for the next years. This is not some accident that happened in Ukraine. It is a challenge to the European security systems, and it can happen again. We have seen it happen before in Georgia, in Ukraine. We can also add Syria at it, and we have seen it again in Ukraine, and it can happen again. I think it was last week when the Russian parliament, the Duma, said they want to abandon the legitimacy of Lithuania to be a country. So there are challenges, and for instance, for the Baltic countries, I've been there 2 months ago, it is not something they can live with that they want to be reconquered. They don't want to be conquered at all, because they see what's happening when Russia conquers a certain area, the war crimes that are happening. They don't want to happen that to them. So it's not just about defending ourselves, defending our partners, but it's also about be able to defend every square meter of NATO territory, because the people living there want to be defended, and I think it is very important that we give them hope that we are willing and able to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faber. Mr. Colby, I'll allow you the first floor to react. I've seen you react a little bit already to my left here. So if you want to, please feel free to comment on what's been said by Mr. Lechte, General Wiermann, or Dr. Faber.
Well, I'll just be very brief. I think both Mr. Lechte and all the comments, but really Mr. Lechte's comments and Dr. Faber, I really fully agree with, and I think that spirit is exactly what, I certainly as an American would hope, and I think all Americans would hope for, which is, if we're going to defend the system and the freedoms and the structures that we all want to defend, then you're going to have to pay for it, and the only sure form of security is to, be able to defend it. And I think we've seen that one of the lessons of the Ukraine conflict that I think we should really take home is that Putin was wrong about his ability to subordinate Ukraine, but he was not wrong that he needed to use military force to achieve his political goals. So that was not an irrational assessment, and he might have the same assessment to, vis-a-vis the Baltics or some others. And if there is weakness and true vulnerability there, that will be an inducement and provocation to the Russians. And that's not, we will pay more once it happens, and we're seeing that in Ukraine. If you have a better deterrent and defense, you won't have to pay. The only thing I would say in reaction to what General Wiermann said, and I agree with much of it, is, you know, I understand that the Americans are saying, in fact, the United States has increased its force presence in the European theater significantly. The administration has its budget proposal is below the rate of inflation, and it is saying that the administration itself, DNI Avril Haines, has stated that the Taiwan threat is acute now before 2027. So you know, if I were here, you know, we're in a political setting, so I can be a little bit political too. I mean, what I would ask my friends in the administration is, how exactly are you raising and sustaining and sending $40 billion to the Ukraine and so forth? And we know that our most sophisticated military analysis is telling us that we're not in a good position in Taiwan. So I think my basic concern, and we were talking about this earlier, is that the time frame in which the threat to Taiwan will become acute is the next 5 years, according to Admiral Davidson, Admiral Aquilino, Avril Haines, Bill Burns. Meantime, Germany's timeline is 10 years, and NATO's timeline to get to a point where they're can really shoulder a significant part of the burden is much longer. And that leads me, and especially now that Russia and China could plausibly be seen to be really collaborating opportunistically and in a kind of collective manner, that is going to present us with a very, very acute situation in the coming years.
Thank you, Mr. Colby. Actually, I noted one difference that I thought you would maybe pick on is that Mr. Faber just said that Germany perceives themselves as being bigger than they probably are. And what I heard out of it, that taking on a lead position within Europe to really provide that security and step in the shoes, let's say, for the US. Don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounded like you were questioning that a little bit, whether Germany really is up for that challenge as of now. If so, I would add another question, and please just indicate to me who wants to speak, and feel free to jump in that. That's probably a foreign policy question also. Is the EU an actor at all for the transatlantic view for NATO? Is that something where, if we discuss whether Germany can step up or not in a bigger role, of course we should ask ourselves with that idea of integrating other forces in Europe, whether that is feasible in the near and mid-term? Yes, so I'll put that up. Yes?
If I may, yeah, no problem at all. NATO, it's not a one-way alliance. That's something we have to discuss also. We always think that NATO was constructed that the US is going to save Europe from the doors of hell when the Iron Curtain was pulled up and the Cold War started. But there's also Article 5 in there for the US. So if the US would be attacked, we had that once in a while when we had the 9/11, we started a war on Afghanistan on NATO-based Article 5. I remember at the time of Chancellor Schröder. And so at the end, NATO, we are talking also about an Indo-Pacific strategy. And we are talking about that in Germany as well. We started that on the last term because of the knowing of the rising fact of China. So actually, when you talk about China, it's not so known facts, but all of us know them, I hope so, that, for example, in between the years of 2014 to 18, so like one legislature of German parliament, they put so many naval vessels to the sea that's the whole Royal Navy of the Great Britain or the Marine or the Navy of Japan. So actually that's a number, and they haven't stopped. They are doing it every day. When we talk about Germany and we are talking about our lovely ships we have in the port of Wilhelmshaven, for example, or wherever they are lying around, there's more experts sitting over there. We don't have enough ships for what we are doing on UN missions to supply that. So what we call our Navy is not capable of helping in the right moment. But if we would build new ships right now, where are the people who are going to serve on that ships? So we minimalized our troops down to 182,000 or something like that, and rising up slightly, we would have been able to hold an army by a treaty of 2+4 that at the end would have been up to 370,000 people in the army. When the heck are you going to get them? Out of the 600,000 we have young people every year coming out of our schools? No way. So that's what we are talking about. And when we are talking about NATO, it's 80% that the US is doing on NATO, combined with the UK. And the rest are 20% of all the others. Wonderful, isn't it? And the Turkish army in that point is the 6th biggest standing army of the world, and that it's controlled by Erdogan. Wonderful, isn't it? So actually what we are doing now is securing our butts for the next century with all what we are doing right now to save them from a Russian-controlled or China-controlled world. Because what happened on the 24th of February was that the plans, the secret chambers of Beijing were also put on light. In the moment they were friends, and we all see that right now. So Russia needs China. China is the biggest friend of Russia, and we have to be frank with ourselves, and that's something new.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, I don't see a lot of Europe in there, like EU as a security actor, but I perfectly understand that. Follow up.
That
yes.
100 billion.
Yes.
Are just a start. It's just a start for what we did in the last decades to our German forces. We will be in a need of multiplied by 5 or 6 to get all on the same stuff we had it at the end of the 80s. And that's fact as well. Nobody wants to talk about that, but that 100 billion is just a start and just the beginning, nothing else.
So, yes, please.
Maybe I can add on the European Union. We have this Sondervermögen, and we are doing it as a nation. And everybody is raising the budgets as a nation. Everybody is procuring on the base of the decision-making in those nations. So Europe started to do something on defense when Britain dropped out, because they basically vetoed it for decades. But the process is way too slow now. So we're talking about special programs where we can harmonize our military medicine, battlefield treatment, so on. That's not the way to do it. So what we're doing now is bilateral. We're having bilateral development programs with France and Spain and other countries as well. But there's no European approach. And I think to invent one, we have to do it, yes, but it is bigger than it cannot be just done by Germany alone. Other countries have to step in, and we have the will to build a European effort on it. I'm not sure if the shock of Putin's war against Ukraine is big enough to trigger such a development in the European Union.
Thank you. General, may I refer to you, because I'd be very curious to hear after this now. So we've talked a little bit before, also the pre-discussion that we had about conventional versus nuclear deterrence, and how the decision or not decision we will see next week at the NATO summit for maybe more or not more members might add or not add. So what's your view, and vis-a-vis Germany as playing a bigger role and stepping up in leadership positions? Do you think, because you already alluded on the fact that having more capabilities doesn't mean that we have also the personnel to really be a bigger and growing force. So what's your view of what Germany needs to be doing in that area, but also maybe, again, a little bit on the European partnership perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you much. First of all, when we look back at the catastrophes of the last century, I think Europe has drawn, or at least the Germans have drawn, 2 lessons from it. There will be no security in Europe without European integration. That's reflected in the European Union. And there will be no security for Europe without American engagement in Europe, and that's NATO. That is not to hide behind this lesson. When we look at EU-NATO cooperation, I think you can see it right now in action. When we look at Ukraine, we have different toolboxes. The European Union has the toolbox of sanctions, and it's using it. NATO has the toolbox of military means, and we are using it to shield our allies against the potential threat from Russia as we speak. Having said that, we have to prepare ourselves for the situation described by Mr. Colby, Elbridge, which is that suddenly there's another conflict on the other side of the globe, and we are faced with a situation where we have to basically deter and provide the bulk of conventional forces. Some of you might have heard what I tried to tell when I talked about conventional forces to be complementary with nuclear deterrence, because there's one element which Germany clearly probably will not provide, and that's nuclear deterrence. So therefore, we remain connected to each other for very good reasons. Connected does not mean that Germany doesn't need to put more emphasis on conventional forces, because if we don't do it, there are few others that will and can do it, and the geographic position again puts us in a place where East European partners and neighbors look at us. And this looking at us has also an emotional component. So if you do not deliver on conventional capabilities that make them feel more safe, this will have a backlash in other fields of politics as well. And I think that's also another issue that needs to be considered. So I'm not going to give up about the lesson. There will be no security for Europe without with American engagement. However, the Europeans need to do a lot to earn that American engagement, and the vital, essential engagement clearly is on the deterrence side, on vertical escalation, I would call it. Again, coming back to the point, there is more now than there was the Cold War when we talk about deterrence. Back to you.
Thank you. Before I ask everyone else to react if they want to, I would like to welcome really briefly Member of Parliament Alexander Graf Lambsdorff. Thank you very much for joining us. He's the Deputy Chair for the Bundestag's parliamentary group of the FDP, and you will deliver the final remarks. If at all you feel that you want to jump in, of course, just indicate so, and I'll give you the floor. Okay, otherwise, then duly noted, I will just give you the floor in the very end. Thank you, General. Would anybody want to react to that?
Just one fact, you see, I'm a guy of numbers. Lithuanian army has a number of 12,500 soldiers. That's it. So if Russia is going to attack Lithuania, when the Chancellor announced that he wants to put up more than 9,000 plus troops to Lithuania. Right now we are there with thousands, and we are not going to be engaged with 9,000 of Germany, but NATO will put 9,000 plus there. That's just to double the army size of Lithuania. And that's what's going on now. And NATO has, at all the contracts that we made with Russia, we were fully safe with them. We made it. We don't station troops in the east part of NATO. And that's what we are doing right now. That's a matter of fact as well.
Yeah. The aim of Lithuania is to defend itself for 48 hours. And this is very optimistic.
With that being said, I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We have about 9 minutes left.
More,
maybe more if you want to. So if you have any questions, I will also give you a second to think about it, although probably you might have, and I hope that some of these inputs already triggered some, because there's, of course, some things that still haven't been discussed. If not, I have another. Yeah, please go ahead. I think you have to just, yes.
I hope it looks fine now. So my English might be a little bit slow because my time in English-speaking circles is a little bit gone already. However, the last 14 days I wrote a book from Mr. Christian Brose, who was a former principal advisor of John McCain. And it took me 14 days to read this book in English, and at present I think it is high value to just think about his ideas and what he is presenting over there, because what he is telling about is that overall the United States in its military has got a systemic problem, and it could be comparable to that in our forces. What he is telling about is that we have to change a little bit more our concepts of military from industrial age kind of forces into modern technology using forces that are really deterring enemy adversaries or enemy forces in a proper way, because the limits that we have, and that was coming up here too, is limits in personnel, for example, and in other resources to really be able to counter foreign capabilities like those in China or even in Russia, who are very close to our allies' borders. Therefore, I would strongly recommend everybody to read about those ideas of Mr. Brose and to think how we were able to use budgets, because budgets itself do not deter anybody. What is deterring some people are capabilities of dangerous forces. And that is what we have to build up very, very urgently. And therefore, my question would be, would it make sense to spend some of the budget in fast changes using modern technology and really to build up really deterrent forces of the information age, the current technology using age, and not forces that come from their conceptual setup basically from the last century. The basic of those ideas are now around 100 years old, and they might have already passed their optimum of conceptual capability.
Thank you very much, sir. I think you've been nodding already, but General, I would also like to give the floor to you also. I want to add on that a little bit that we've been discussing the conventional war or not that we've been seeing here, and I think I had a conversation the last week about so what are the wars we're fighting now? Who wants to go first, you or? Okay.
Yeah, thank you much for the question. You invite me for a 1-hour briefing. However, I'll try to make it much shorter. When you will read, hopefully, the strategic concept of NATO in early July, you'll find a few paragraphs on the need for NATO to undergo digital transformation, to make use of big data, artificial intelligence, and emerging and disruptive technologies. And there will be some accompanying initiatives. You will find the words Diana. You will find the word venture capital fund for NATO. So we are looking at that. The NATO command structure was the backbone and the glue of the alliance in the industrial age. That's true. We are now in the information age, and therefore the NATO command structure needs to be supported by or become a digital backbone for military operations. We know the conventional military operations, air forces, land forces, navies. We have to add and have added in NATO the new domains of space and cyber. And it will be a challenge to actually orchestrate all these effects in a way that the military commander can use them all. So we are looking at it, and we understand, and there is a dilemma. And there is a dilemma, how much do you invest in current capabilities because you have to be prepared tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, and how much do you reserve for looking into the future And of course, that's a balancing act that happens every day in NATO when we look at the NATO defense planning process, which builds on two components. It's today's requirements, and it's what we have to do for the future. We even have two strategic commands. Allied Command Operations in Mons, looking at today, and we have Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia, looking at tomorrow. So I think we understand the challenges. However, they are significant, and we have to successfully deal with them. Back to you.
So thank you. I'd just like to fully agree with you. Chris Bro's book is really a masterpiece. It's one of the most important books written certainly on foreign policy, but certainly on defense issues, and it's had a major effect. As you may recall, I believe the book opens with an anecdote of Chris and Senator McCain meeting with David Ochmanek, who's a very well-regarded, actually he had the same job I had in the Pentagon, big shoes, but a very respected RAND military analyst, and it begins with the problem I was alluding to in my conversation with General Wiermann, which is how difficult the Taiwan fight is. And so Chris's, as I understand it, his thinking is really, as you suggest, our potential adversaries are right on the border of our ally commitments. And China is 10 times the size of Russia economically and is much more capable in high tech. So China has the advantages of size, proximity. It's been focused on the Taiwan problem exclusively, essentially, for 25 years from a force planning point of view, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, while we've been doing all kinds of different things, many of them not successful. And they have the catch-up advantages, some of it through theft, some of it through things that they just have been able to kind of figure out on their own, and now have possibly surpassed us in some areas, like maybe elements of the hypersonic domain. So looking at all that, Chris is trying to wrestle, and continues to try to wrestle with how do we overcome this problem in a plausible way. One of the things he's pointing to is the structure of organization and the integration of technology as a way of simply overhauling, because our tradition, and this is one of the things we really pointed out in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, is the post-Cold War American way of war, which our armed forces had perfected with Desert Storm, and then afterward, now the Chinese and the Russians have gone to school on it and now have figured out how to get after with things like anti-access area denial and now even Chinese power projection. Different ways of going after the problem. What I'll briefly say on the technology front is I fully endorse the logic of what Chris is saying. The devil is in the details of organizational reform and actually bringing these technologies into method and production that can actually be deployed effectively. And in some sense, what we're seeing in Ukraine, to me, is actually that high technology is not a magical, not that Chris would say this, but it's a magical solution, but can only be part of it. I'll leave you with a final thought, which is Chris's response. We did an event together around my book at the Carnegie Endowment a few months ago, and Chris's comment was, my biggest problem with Bridges' book is it's not radical enough. So when I talk about the problems here, Chris's critique is that I'm underestimating the scale of the problem.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the audience? Seeing none, I had received one online actually. I'd like to dispose it to the panel, and you can decide who wishes to respond to it. And that went into the White Book of 2016. So Germany does not have a national security strategy. We're working on one now. Well, not I, but Germany is. So we have a white book that was published irregularly on security, defense, foreign policy, and other areas, priorities. Anyway, so the question is, in that white book, Germany talks about several types of threats we have to prepare for. One is energy dependency. One is a number of other supply chain crises and conflicts around us, China and Russia and everything. And the question is, so with our reaction to Ukraine, with the sanctions that we impose, there's some effects that we use that actually harm us as well in this question. So with sanctions on Russia, we harm our energy supply. So the question merely is how conflicting are some of the strategies that we apply? How sustainable is the German or the Western strategy in general? And what are the strategic ambitions that we would have to define as the West? it's a difficult question. It's also a little bit of a longer one. So let's just sit for a second.
Maybe we share. I go for the strategic ambition. I think our ambition has to be to defend ourselves. To defend ourselves, we have to be the first when it comes to technology, to the ability, also industrial capability. So this is about innovation as well. It's about digital warfare as well. And we are not ahead of all of that because we denied it for a long time. So yes, to reaching the strategic ambition to be able to defend not our own nation, but also our partners, I think the American phrase would be to lead the world again. But that's not our aim. Maybe we catch up with whoever leads the world again to have a fair share in how the world will go tomorrow.
Well, the general just relied on the new strategic of the NATO. We are also going to have a new national security strategy built up this year. It should be published in February next year. That's the plans of the Foreign Ministry. We are also talking about a new China strategy we had in our coalition treaty that's going to be released afterwards. So there's a bunch to do. And I think all of us are building up new synapses in their brains right now. I can tell you, being Catholic and knowing what's going on sometimes, that I, for myself, never thought that there would be a total war on Ukraine done by Russia on the 24th. And I think a bunch of people didn't believe that would happen in that time. So actually, we have to find new strategies, we have to find new energy in the world, we have to build up new goals. Nobody thought that if we would have so much trade with Russia that they would start a war in Europe. That's it. And we had that same strategy with China for decades, and we see now that China is not a communist country anymore. It's a nationalist-based country right now, and that's always a bad thing. We know that out of our own history, what happens when big countries find nationalism, and what they are doing over there in Asia. The only one who can be their adversary is the US, and so we have to see to find our own security for Europe. And we are just 550 million people without the Russians, something like that. So that's it. That's our new strategy, and we have to find it fast, and it has to be reliable for the next decades as well.
Thank you. So seeing that the time's actually running up and there's no other question in the room, I have one closing question for all panelists, and there's no explanation needed. If there is one, people can approach you probably afterwards over a cold drink. So please, and I will just go in the opposite order as how I started, please complete the following sentence. The top 3 areas for action or need for immediate improvement in German defense policy are. So, Dr. Faber.
The German defense policy is it's not just about Germany. So I think help for Ukraine is the most urgent issue that needs to be improved first. Second, I think we need to improve our armed forces when it comes to transformation to a digital age, so we at least can communicate with our partners, which is not the case right now. And then we need a lot of ammunition.
Okay, help for Ukraine, digitalization, ammunition. General.
Yeah, very briefly. First, this is a national issue and nothing for NATO to comment on. Thank you much.
You may also present your personal view. Okay, Mr. Lechte.
Building up our new synapse really fast, finding the point of that we are the giant out of the view of the others in the middle, and they want us to be a leading nation. We don't like to lead, but we have to. and we have to accept our new role, and that we are not just being based on our great economy, that we are also based on other things we are able to achieve if we want to. It's hard, but we have to, because there's no way I want to live in a Russian, Chinese-based world. Americans sometimes have some interesting leaders as well, relying on Donald Trump. But you see, I'm fully aware of what McDonald's and all the rest did to the world, and it's better than what the others have in mind for us.
Thank you, Mr. Colby.
Well, as an American, I share the general's assessment that it's not my business, other than to say that I think we would all benefit really from a strong German force that can do the kinds of things that Dr. Faber exactly was talking about. And just briefly, maybe I'll say, and Mr. Lechte, since so much of this has to do with will, I mean, Germany clearly has the capacity, and I would say, while we're in the spirit of history, I mean, to me, we look back, so much of what motivates my sense of urgency is that when we look back at why the terrible wars have happened and why the war didn't happen in the Cold War, when it very well might have, is because, including us, and failed to act sufficiently and robustly enough in advance of the war. And if we had acted a little bit more, even, then in a way, I'm just thinking as you were talking, our situation in the 30s was not totally dissimilar from maybe Germany's, in the sense that it's not, we didn't have to, but if we had acted for ourselves even, you know, I mean, my family, grandfathers were in the war and so forth, and many Americans, but that's not to say that it was our fault or anything, but we were the ones who probably could have avoided the whole thing, possibly. And that's a heavy responsibility. That, I mean, all of our countries have their pasts, but I'm just thinking, if we take that lesson really to heart, then, you know, the worst case if we prepare too much is that we've spent a little bit too much on defense, and you know, we have probably gone into military interventions that I don't think were a good idea. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about regime changing some country here. We're talking about making sure that our established perimeter is well defended. You know, if we over prepare and Putin or Xi Jinping never really wanted to do it, well, then I don't really believe that, but then we've spent a little bit too much money. But if we don't prepare and something terrible happens, then we will pay a lot more, and we'll rue that decision. And I'm just and I think if anything else, to your point about what Ukraine shows us, is that major war is possible, that it can pay, especially for a leader like a Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. So don't give them the basis for assessing that it can be advantageous.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Graf Lambsdorff.
Well, thank you so much. This has been inspiring, interesting, fascinating partly, and I'd like to thank the panelists, the organizers, Teresa, you as a brilliant moderator. And you know, it's always good to start with an anecdote. The book starts with an anecdote. My anecdote tonight is that I have come to this panel straight from Riga. I was just in the Baltics, and the two presidents of Germany and Latvia reopened the church. Latvian flags everywhere. In Riga airport, there was an Estonian plane with the Estonian flag and a Lithuanian plane with the Lithuanian flag. Now, you couldn't show these flags 30 years ago. It was forbidden in the Soviet Union to show the national colors of these three NATO allies. So when we're talking about freedom, we're not talking about something abstract. We're talking about something very specific. When we talk about defending every square inch of NATO territory, we are taking on a commitment to defend freedom, the freedom of these nations to determine their future. But when I read your speech, excellent, reminded me very much of Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, explaining to Europeans why Asia is really important to America. But when I read your speech, there was this one thing where you said, you know, the leading nation to take on the task of defending freedom, every square inch of it and of the territory, is Germany. And I went like, oh, really? Has that really sunk in? Is that really so? Do we have the capability, the mindset? Markus Faber mentioned the mindset. And then there's a paradoxical situation. In old West Germany, when our armed forces were strictly national and fully integrated in NATO, etc., we had really large armed forces. 500,000 just in West Germany, 300,000 East Germany. Now we're 180,000. 180,000. And we're asked to take on a task like this. Wow. Are we ready for that? And when I think about that, I think that this change of mindset has to come from a recognition of two things. One is what Elbridge here shared with us. From Washington, D.C., the Atlantic is just one ocean, the Pacific is the other one, and the more threatening one because China is a peer superpower. Russia is not. Russia is difficult and brutal and everything, but it's not a peer to the United States any longer. So it's up to us Europeans. And that's number one. Number two is we have to recognize we live in an interwar period. There was a First World War and a Second World War. There was a first Cold War, and there will be a second Cold War. And we are entering that. And that is not something that happens on just one day, and everybody declares, now that's the Cold War. No, we are gradually going into this Cold War. Decoupling, economic warfare, cyber warfare, all of these things are happening. Proxy wars, avoidance of nuclear conflict. I mean, you see all the elements that you could see in the first Cold War slowly emerging, gradually emerging now in our day and age. And that means that we do have to live up to this task, the task that was just laid out here. And let me say one final thing. I'm really grateful to Markus, Ulrich, and all the other panelists for having been here, because when we have this opportunity to have meetings like this in the German parliament, and we talk about changing the mindset of our compatriots and making them aware of these really historic challenges that we're facing, then all of you who have come here, I would expect, have a certain interest in the topic, but you also have a certain responsibility. Talk to your friends, talk to your families. They may look at you as if you were turning into a falcon, a hawk, a warmonger, somebody who, no. Explain the situation. And for all its horrors, if the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown one thing, that it is that war is still a means of international politics. And that we have to take the responsibility for our friends, our allies, for our freedoms and our liberties as Germany. And we have to make a valuable contribution to the alliance. I know that the United States are not going to turn away from Europe. That's not going to happen. But the posture is going to be different, and the defense posture of 2018 was a sea change in that. Absolutely, it was crucial. So, you have a responsibility. Don't just listen to the panelists and enjoy the entertainment. Take up the baton, the mantle, if you wish, go out there and proselytize. Tell people about what this situation is about and what is our responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And take up a glass of wine too.